described in the advert. And I'm very glad to welcome you to this event, which is one of our public engagement events, which we are co-hosting with an organization called the Awal Socio-Economic Research Unit. And Angelo is one of the speakers, works as a director of research in that unit. So I just want to say a bit about the aims and the reasoning behind this talk. As many of you know, World Food Day is an international event on the 16th of October, held each year, which coincides with the establishment of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. And one reason why we subtitle this event A Response to World Food Day, as opposed to, for example, a World Food Day event, is the need to question the politics and solutions offered by the UN and the FAO. Two challenges around food and human well-being. Hopefully we're going to discuss a lot of this, and a lot of it will be raised by the panelists, but some of the problems that a critical analysis of the FAO and World Food Day raises are, it supports very often genetically modified foods. It doesn't pay attention to climate change, ecological issues. It also endorses transnational corporations, the whole big food industry, and displaces peasants and small farmers. So many, many other issues. So while World Food Day seems to be supporting an end to hunger and enabling a healthy and dignified human relationships to food for all, it's in fact often doing quite the opposite. So one aim of this discussion is to raise the kinds of questions that are usually neglected in World Food Day events. And some of these are, what is the quality of the food that's available to different people? And who defines this quality? Why is it so important to focus attention on questions of quality and not simply quantity, which is of course what the FAO often does focus on, an end to hunger, irrespective of the nature of the food that's provided. Other questions is, why is the focus in discussions of food, and I'm sure many of you have seen this, so often about ending hunger, and not also about a much more holistic way of thinking about food and the pleasures of eating, and what we derive as human social beings from eating. So we have an excellent panel to deal with these and related questions, and I'm just going to introduce them briefly, and then each of them will do a short presentation, and then we'll open it up. So let me start with Sayan, who's immediately to my left. Sayan Khan is a food activist and seed archivist, and I think for those of you who don't know what that means, she'll talk about it. She's committed to exploring food in transdisciplinary, creative and people-centered ways. Rue Fukusa is a chef and food blogger committed to experimenting with healthy and sustainably grown produce. Heidi Swanby has a very long history, I think it's about 2 decades, in the food sovereignty movement. Sorry, I have a cold. And she is at the moment trying to do a research PhD which looks at questions of freedom and justice in broader ways than the usual food activist discourse does. Angelo Fick is Director of Research at ASRI. And Angelo, if you don't mind, my voice has just run out. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. Okay, so we'll start with, no, I'm just going to cough. I'm so sorry, Angelo. Let's start with Sayan.
Hello, everyone. Okay. It's a beautifully broad topic. We were discussing earlier, it would be wonderful to do much more than the panel today, to take it further. It was a little bit difficult to try to keep it to a brief discussion, but I'm going to do my best. And hopefully in the discussion that follows, we can tap into a lot more of what might be missing for you, or just in terms of inquiry. Okay. In the pursuit of meaning and solutions, and in light of our current dominant global world order, I am emboldened by what is known as the alternative, which is not actually an alternative. And by working within the nuances and understanding what these nuances are, the things that fall in the in-betweens, and how to capacitate these spaces and work from an interdisciplinary perspective. So this is to work between and with and combine different disciplines, as opposed to either or trying to marry two that don't quite see eye to eye. And so I journey through food from a very ancient perspective, and this is in an attempt to reach solutions that are not hindered or influenced by any kind of colonial structure or what we have currently as our free market systems. And I'm by no means trying to romanticize this ideal of what the ancient past is and was. But ultimately, I'm venturing into a spiritual politic that is embedded in a social, political, environmental, and so many other descriptions. And this is towards a spiritual sovereignty, reconnecting, connecting, and reclaiming a relationship with food and land and seed outside, before, beyond our financialized systems. So one of the, I guess, difficulties or realities is that food doesn't sit comfortably anywhere. It's not within government departments. There's no Department of Food and Nutrition yet. It doesn't sit comfortably within many academic spaces, apart from this wonderful critical food studies, future students. And also within organizations, it's often land-based organizations. So this idea or the thinking around food is not something, it's something very recent. So it's difficult to place, but it fits and it sits everywhere. It's everybody's concern, and conditions seem to worsen each year. Child stunting, malnutrition, exorbitant food waste, severe hunger, this hyper-industrialized food creating caloric solutions to fill empty stomachs to push our labor force forward. We've got food trends creating exclusivity out of traditions and appropriating marginalized cultures. And it often feels as if we are building on broken ground. And of course, our systems are inherited from colonial practice through an apartheid practice and into neoliberal legacy. So how I came to do this was that my life has been marked by very strong, very visceral moments of depression. And somehow I've been able to mark these moments with solutions. So depression has led to investigations into identity, into land, into history, into love. And when I was 19, I understood that I was born in this body for a reason, or I chose to understand. And that it would always be with the hardship of having this body in this time, in this city. And that in that somehow was a lesson, and perhaps some answers. Why through this family that I was born into, being Muslim, being a woman of color, being this age in this land, so complex and so difficult. And it's Cape Town. Cape Town, so complex, so difficult. And so I began to focus on what made this space different and what I could do to illuminate this difference in terms of self-care, but also in terms of a broader healing of the land. And so Cape Town, in this space, in this region, we reside in such diversity that the rates of endemism are some of the highest in the world. We sit at an origin of humanity, where survival, back in the day, pre-colonial, meant generosity and at times euphoric happiness. This in a landscape where minerals, sweet waters, plants, animal nutrition, fungi, spices, medicines have all been in abundance. But most of this knowledge is completely wiped out. Initially through such tragedy as smallpox epidemic, which killed the majority of indigenous populations and which was one of the first ills the colonizers brought with them, but subsequently through organized genocide, legal, and then through the erasing of cultural expression, access to land, forced removals, and the futile attempts at restitution that we've had and continue to have. So we've inherited a lot of trauma, and it's embedded in the land in each one of us. And to do this work of working through food as an attempt to find solutions means working through a lot of grief for those who choose to acknowledge it, or rather for those who it chooses to work through. And this kind of particularly comes to light when I speak about, when I focus in on working through indigenous food reclamation. So this has been deep work for about a decade now for me, and it's been a process of revival, but then it became reclamation very quickly because it became clear that indigenous food as a trend was not an answer. And it wasn't answering questions about food security, but it was very easy to talk about or access financial gains and like fame. And at the same time, to think that reviving forgotten foods would be a solution is to also not fully understand what's at stake, or to understand the kind of stigmas towards food and aspirations, and often working through very heavily embedded notions of armamensis, of course, when working with very marginalized spaces or communities, such as women farm workers. So aspiration has become such a huge part of our food culture and such a huge part of our foodways, and it might not seem obvious to a kind of comfortable middle class, but it is very evident elsewhere. And so the space from which I do the work that I do is to acknowledge that our very cultures and traditions have been poisoned by a monoculture of being, and encouraged by systems that have led our countries for the past few hundred years, and basically the world, influencing the very nature, our nature, the nature, and how we engage with the world. And this is, to give an example of that, is so we see Cape Town as the seat of coloniality, right? This was an entry point into the region because of the ocean access. And those that came to settle and were encouraged by the abundance of sweet waters and and I assume they arrived at a time that was when we still had a lot of our wild greens available that was full of vitamin C that could help cure scurvy from being on the ship for so long, that the Dutch East India Company was the first multinational corporation to set foot and to create systems within our space, within this space. And that then became systems that became adopted further down the line to where we are today. So the way that the world is has obviously been inherited by many generations and many ways of being. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how this relates to seed, and a little bit about the idea of poison, and poison as a tool to uncover or inquire about foods that we have maybe hints in these very old books about being eaten, but how do we look at that in a very kind of modern landscape in time? So in terms of seeds and indigenous food, seeds hold many keys to our relationship with land. My thesis at the moment, the dissertation that I'm doing, is around the way we relate to seeds and the way that seed has become objectified. It's a very obvious tool that we can look at to see how industrialization and corporate control has taken over life, basically. But thinking of food from a cultivation perspective, if we look at indigenous food or forgotten foods or foods that are still wild harvested, so sour figs, for example, right? You get a kilogram of sour figs. You eat 5 of them, they all have different flavor profiles. Yet if I'm going to buy a kilogram of oranges for juicing, they all taste the same. This is, of course, many, many years, hundreds of years of cultivation, of selection, of breeding. And so the work with seed is, A, to speak with people, especially elders who have memory of cultivating these seeds, especially within a landscape like the Cape, which is basically sand, and being able to cultivate a library, a treasure of stories, community connection. about these seeds and to be able to share them. And so we're at the very beginning, so there's lots of different kinds of seeds, from medicines to trees to vegetables and fruits, and a lot of focus on indigenous varieties and a lot of experimentation. The seed library, it's called the Seed Bibliotheek, by the way. It's also open access, so if you would like access to the library, you just need to speak to me. And then lastly, I think I'm okay for time, eh? Lastly, looking at the landscape, and when I speak about land, I'm speaking about ocean as well. It doesn't get separated, right? And when I speak of producers, it's the same. It's everybody, because there's so many different flavors of bitterness, for example. And bitterness is such an important flavor profile to consume because it helps so much with the functioning and metabolism in our bodies. And the eating of certain foods that we used to eat, not everybody in the world, but where it was available, and foods that have become culturally frowned upon, like eating insects that have now become very trendy, and this idea of future food, is because eating these things at times when nothing else was available, or at times where things were scarce, or even in times of abundance, there's very particular nutrition, and not just that, but flavor that comes from these specific places. And so the landscape, so when you're doing this work around indigenous food, and reclaiming that is a work to work through people's likes and dislikes, because who's going to voluntarily have bitterness when they could have sweetness, right? And so it takes a lot of convincing, it takes a lot of work in food transformation, preparing foods, fermenting foods, leaching foods in the ocean for 2 weeks and blah, blah, blah. It's like intense. It's a lot of work that requires a lot of burning of calories before you actually consume the food. But it's an initial step to be able to, like I said, because of genocide, so much of that knowledge and information has been lost. And how do you encourage that? And so you work through spiritual practice, through dreaming, through experimentation, and be able to afford that again. And so my last point is that what that means, essentially, is that sometimes, and I have a lot of friends who do this as well, but they don't seem to have done it to this extent, sometimes you poison yourself. And so it's not often we get a platform to talk about poisons. I'm going to tell you 1 or 2 stories. But you can push your body to a level where you are experiencing plants that can you just phone me in an hour and see that I'm still okay? Which is the last thing you want to tell your mother, and she doesn't want to hear that, but she did. She phoned me and everything was okay, but I did wake up and I felt this palpitation still going, still strong. Like, okay, but at least it's not worse, so I'm not dying and I'm not having a heart attack or some kind of panic attack. So I'll carry on sleeping and see how it feels. And by the morning, it was fine. And my teeth were very, very clean. But it's not something that I would then go on and share with people because it's too volatile. That kind of information is dangerous. And there are many of these examples that I have, and maybe I should write it up sometime. But it's an important part of the process to say that our food is so hyper-industrialized and caught up in capital that it doesn't concern itself much deeper spiritual practice and the work with broader community. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be giving a culinary perspective to the discussion. So eating is universal, and every human being that is alive relies on food for sustenance. And what differentiates us as people is our tastes, our yearnings. This involved challenging the perceptions of what I know about food, questioning what it means to me, and how I came to know it. I started to consider what good food means. And does it simply come down to taste? If so, which taste? The biological one or the cultural? I enjoy what I do, building flavors with food, especially vegetables, familiar flavors that resonate within individuals' pleasure centers to achieve the best tasting food. These are they're foods that we love at one go, and then there are foods that we love, that we grow to love, an acquired taste. Think blue cheese, anchovies, dark chocolate, sushi, mopani worms even. Our senses are closely linked when it comes to food. Flavor is closely linked to smell and texture. Scientists have discovered that we can detect 5 senses, and these are salt, sweet, sour, bitter, and umami. Our genes determine how sensitively we react to each of these. So for instance, if I were to hand out a plate of olives to the audience, the way you would enjoy or not enjoy is determined by how you've experienced olives in the past, how you articulate their taste, their texture, and their presentation. Naturally, my culinary aesthetic is colorful, vibrant-looking dishes. This comes from a cultural norm where food, especially chicken, should never be served white. Bland, without color, that would be a disgrace, a waste of meat. It must be browned, even if it means cooking the life out of it. Research suggests that the way food is arranged on the plate affects the perception of taste and enjoyment of the dish. A study focusing on the impact of aesthetic food arrangements found that food that looks more like a work of art is perceived to taste better than if their ingredients were neatly arranged or tossed together on a plate. And judging from the likes on my Instagram feed, I think this might be true. In Shona, we have a saying, kujgani maziso, which means we eat with our eyes. We are attracted to beautiful things. So does this explain why dishes like tripe or pig's trotters would not be appetizing to some people? Well, they say the difference between prawns and mopani worms is the marketing. So this is possibly why we create hierarchies of cuisine based on our senses, what we see and believe to be delicious, what we see and believe to be a delicious plate of food. How morbidly shallow. We also rely heavily on our senses to act as defense mechanisms, to be able to distinguish good food from bad food. Our senses are ready to reject anything that we perceive to be poison. Any brilliant chef will tell you that in order to be truly successful, one needs to push the boundaries of flavors, going beyond the tried and tested, using your unique experience to inform new combinations of food textures to stimulate the senses. This means being able to articulate people's genetic food preferences while matching it with their socially conditioned preferences to create a beautiful plate of harmonious gastronomy. Rocket science, right? If you're a fan of MasterChef like I am, you'll be familiar with the term molecular gastronomy, simply explained as where food science meets the culinary arts. Molecular gastronomy is applying scientific knowledge about ingredient interactions to modify and transform the texture and appearance of our food. It is thinking out of the box, creating unconventional flavor combinations that enhance your perception and liking to a food. It is surprising the consumer through unexpected tastes or temperatures. It is creating a dining experience that envelops all of your senses: sight, smell, touch, texture, and sound. So the next time you hear a chef bragging about it, don't ignore it. It's culinary genius. Our food preferences paint a picture of who we are, our genetics, our culture, and social conditioning. But this should be in no way limiting. Growing food for subsistence was part of my upbringing. We grew maize, groundnuts, sweet potatoes, and a variety of greens in our backyard. This was common practice for most of the families in the neighborhood I grew up in Harare. The affinity for cooking with fresh, seasonal produce has only increased with time, and it goes without saying that the quality of the produce we cook ultimately impacts the taste of the food we produce. The fresher the food, the better the food tastes and more appetizing it looks. South Africans are becoming increasingly more aware of what they consume, giving rise to a greater interest in healthier, sustainable, and ethically sourced food. For me and many other chefs, this means finding alternative sources of produce other than the mainstream, thus supporting small-scale urban farmers growing seasonal produce. The Economist named 2019 Year of the Vegan. the popularity of veganism has exploded in South Africa. And according to a Google Trends report, the Western Cape is the province where veganism is by far the most popular. We must not forget, however, that veganism is not new. Pre-colonial Africans relied predominantly on a plant-based diet. Africans were renowned foragers. Veganism in our society today is largely characterized by expensive plant-based foods such as nut milks, butters, and other processed things of Western origin. Historically, the vegan diet consisted of grains such as sorghum and millet, and veganism is largely progressing from being solely based on diet to becoming a lifestyle and ideology. While the interest in veganism soars, South Africans are still huge consumers of meat. The context of meat is deeply rooted in South African heritage, and according to the data provided by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, South Africa is the 8th highest in consumption of poultry in the world, with 38.7 kg per capita. The demand for meat is greatly influenced by factors such as availability, price, its use in traditional dishes, as well as the symbolism attached to it. A recent study on food pathways of the poor found that among Black urban populations, meat is often associated with high socioeconomic status, so people try to consume it on a daily basis. The cost of living in urban environments forces many to consume cheaper alternatives, such as tripe and other processed meat products. There are huge gaps in research when it comes to assessing food consumption changes in South Africa and paying particular attention to the quality of food, government regulation of ethically produced and organic foods. As a food creative, it is vital to be conscious of the meanings attached to food, the ways in which it is perceived by all of the senses. It is also my responsibility to challenge the status quo by interrogating so-called food trends in relation to the rich cultural and historical context that exists. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is rocket science.
Hi, everybody. Okay, so in the early 90s, quite by chance, I found myself on a farm in the Netherlands where I learned about permaculture and biodynamics. I was truly astonished after my first day. I had never been taught about ecology, the intricate loops of relationships between multiple creatures and natural processes, about the intelligence, creativity, and agency of nature and non-humans, and most definitely not in the context of food production. Perhaps Darwin's theories about the survival of the fittest, that powerful concept driving the dominating culture's relentless competitiveness, were foremost in my understanding about nature. Permaculture is all about observing the nature and environment around you to understand the essence, habits, and needs of each creature or element in your food production system. These observations are put into carefully designing bespoke food production systems. In this way, nature ultimately does a lot of the work for you. For example, certain plants can provide protection against insects or give nitrogen to the soil. Chickens can clear new land for planting, simultaneously fertilizing it. Strategically planted trees on swales assist with water capture and harvesting, and so on. Every element supports other elements, creating a relational, multifunctional, and regenerative system. Over the years, I've seen some genuine food jungles created in this way, systems outputting an incredible variety of foods, medicines, fodder, and other products. Although the presence of marigolds and comfrey always signals a permaculture garden, each garden is unique and emerges with the efforts of humans, the institutions that they interact with and supply, the local environment, and the resources available. I don't have a scrolling page. Old school. In the intervening years, I began to wonder how I felt about the possibly over-utilitarian nature of permaculture design. But all these years later, I can still access the feeling of shock that I had never been taught this knowledge as a matter of course. It seemed to be the most basic and crucial knowledge about the workings of our planet. It was akin to being told in my adulthood that I'd been adopted and had to reassess my whole understanding of who I may be. It was also like a religious epiphany, where all at once I became a member of a vast, living Earth community, rather than a member of the only sentient species on a dead planet. Happily, through my work, I was able to work with smallholder farmers, mostly in the SADC region, and also to spend time with communities who are charged with maintaining and protecting sacred sites, often through maintaining ritual and enforcing taboo. I began to glimpse worlds where relations between humans, non-humans, and the spiritual realm could be quite natural and also highly functional. Since then, I've been intrigued that the sentience of our planet is the dominant culture's dirty little secret, and how and why that secret is maintained. Many scholars, in large part led by ongoing feminist thinking and inquiry, have shown how the vilification of the body, emotion, and the material world by a rational ontology, or understanding reality through purely rational means, is key to a culture of domination, exploitation, and imperialism. The scientific revolution's binary conceptions of culture and nature, of the sacred and the profane, and of primitive and progress still remain at the core of the modern Western worldview. Carol Merchant asserts that Western culture's abiding preoccupation with mastering nature through science, technology, and capitalism has effectively recast the earth and its natural resources as existing for the purpose of exploitation of man, and it has come at the expense of nature, women, minorities, and indigenous peoples. New materialist feminist work by scholars such as Donna Haraway, Elizabeth Gross, and Karen Barad show that biology and matter are shaped by multiple forces, but at the same time also have agency in forging social and political realities. Donna Haraway makes a strong case for trusting the vantage points of the subjugated by tapping into situated and embodied knowledges. These vantage points and knowledges, she says, may be less blind to the denials of the dominant perspective and therefore hold great transformative capacity. Let me give you a stark example to show how Western ways of knowing, which are established on universal and abstract concepts, rather than situational and visceral being, can oppress. The example comes from researchers working with Mexican smallholders on issues around genetically modified maize. Mexico is the birthplace of maize. Thousands of varieties of maize have been fostered over the centuries by generations of farmers who have an intimate, sacred, and familial relationship to the crop. However, when farmers were invited to share their perceptions of and experience with genetically modified maize, the usual discourse on scientific safety, contamination, and regulation effectively disabled their ability to represent their opinions, which were visceral, emotional, and concrete in nature. This ontological disconnect meant that when smallholders moved from the discourse that had been set, it was as if they had not spoken at all. World Food Day is the day that we commemorate the establishment of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, which was established to deal with food insecurity in the wake of World War II. It has been on the global agenda since 1979, and world leaders have continuously struggled with the complex problem of dealing with hunger, growing human populations, and dwindling environmental resources. However, the last FAO report on the state of food security and nutrition estimates that some 2 billion people are suffering from food insecurity around the globe. Additionally, we are now contending with the triple burden of hunger, malnutrition, and obesity, with obesity being recognized as a form of malnutrition arising from the nutrition transition to modern urban life, poverty, and the availability of cheap, calorie-dense, but nutrient-deficient foods. Whatever we've been doing since the first World Food Day in 1979 is clearly not working. Ironically, some of the most hungry people in the world are the people laboring to produce our food. Over the past 2 days, UWC has been hosting a farm workers conference. I didn't attend, so I can't give a full account of what happened there, and no doubt a number of you in the room were there. However, I'm well acquainted with ongoing struggles and campaigns of some who were presenting, and was following various Twitter feeds as the proceedings went on. One of the tweets that came through said, "Again and again, presentations and voices at the Farm Worker Conference have come back to one defining theme: the suffering of workers, the failure of policy and regulation, the inability of government to intervene effectively, and farmers' impunity and unwillingness to change." But almost everything said thus far has been said before, again and again over the last 25 years. We've been beating our heads on the same brick wall for 25 years. I'm almost certain that one of the reasons that we're stuck lies in our loyalty to Western ontology. I can't see how we can open fresh ground unless we embrace the material world again, allow our bodies and emotions to guide us, and to collaborate with the agency of the living world around us. It's a difficult move because it strips power from the dominating culture and evolves knowledge and expertise. My current master's thesis research is titled "Following the Body: The Role of the Visceral in Expanding Freedoms in an Oppressive Food System." The topic emerged as I began to wonder if love, pleasure, emotions, relationality, and the body could credibly feature in struggles for better food systems, alongside the other crucial issues of social, economic, and environmental justice. There are about 3,000 micro-farmers operating in and around Cape Town, producing mostly organic produce on small municipal lots, schoolyards, and other bits of land. I wondered if paying attention to the visceral experience of these farmers may open up new ideas about future transformed food systems. One farmer that I interviewed told me that she realized that she had a deep passion for children who struggle with learning and social disabilities, and it was this passion that led her to set up her market garden at a school. A portion of the garden is set aside for the children to plant and experience working with the soil, and the school harvests food as they need. She's particularly enamored with aromatic plants, which she has noticed have a calming effect on the children. There's one boy in particular who has taken to the garden. He's known as a troublemaker, too difficult to deal with, a throwaway child. He's easily overstimulated by social engagement. But the garden has become a place where he can have some solitude and quiet and return to class calmer. The fact that the garden has enabled this boy to show other facets of himself to his community is a great joy for her. Her livelihood is derived from the garden, and so, of course, production, markets, and marketing are important pillars in her daily activity. While she does speak of income and markets and the worlds associated with these, she returns all the time to her relationship with the garden and how it has brought quality of life and fulfillment. She credits the garden with teaching her how to speak in front of others, something which she could never do before. Her deep engagement in learning with the garden means that she can speak directly from her experience, and this gives her courage. This has resulted in her becoming a figure in certain political platforms, extending her networks across the country and the SADC region. My discussions with her revealed co-evolving networks related to education, nutrition, production skills and resources, marketing and entrepreneurial worlds. political platforms, various local community interest groups, youth and job creation, research institutions, and much more. These are the kinds of realities that are missed by policy driven by purely developmental factors and non-governmental organizations that need to report to their donors on the outcomes they have achieved and correlate that with the money spent and the number of beneficiaries they've reached. This kind of development sees her primarily as a beneficiary of what they choose to offer. This farmer was propelled into action from a visceral place, a place of passion and purpose, as I'm sure many of us are. She explained to me, I don't know how I wanted to make a difference in my community, and I didn't know how I wanted to do it, but I knew the vision I had. The possible things I could do opened up the impossible dreams. In conclusion, I'm loving studying food systems from a new materialist ontology that allows me to engage with the agency of the human and non-human, as well as semiotic relations such as concepts, ideas, values, and memories. I find a great vitality in the way that it brings a new relationship with micro and macro sociologies, allowing us at last to take political and economic insights from daily activities and focus on the production of the social world at the everyday event. It gives credence to the agency of what Donna Haraway calls the marked bodies, those subjugated others, and it takes into account the agency of the non-human as we dance in the endless, minute-by-minute procession of events, comprising the material effects of both nature and culture. Karen Barrett contends that embodiment brings an ontology of difference, more possibilities than correct and incorrect, opens the way for novelty, allows for greater articulation, new language, new measures, new ways of coming into being. I'm not sure how we will move there, but I've learned that the things I can do may open up the impossible dreams.
So, is this working? No. Okay, so brief introduction as Desiree instructed me to do. I'm the Director of Research at the Owl Socioeconomic Research Institute. I worked in the academy for 20 years, teaching in both the humanities and later in the applied sciences, and then did a stint in public television, well, in television, which meant I worked and lived in public, and now I work for a small NPO that looks at socioeconomic rights, and I engage on questions of research. When the topic first came to me, I must admit that I thought of it as an exile from Cape Town, that I had not lived here in this millennium, really. I spent a year in Cape Town in 2008, but prior to that, I left in 2000 and haven't really lived here. And so the combination of food, pleasure, and poison was for me to look at it from somebody who had both been here and was no longer here, but came back often enough. And the way in which I thought about it, it loomed very largely in my approach to the topic that the figure of the mother focused very much my approach to food, poison, and pleasure in Cape Town. And I say the figure of the mother, not the mother itself, because of course I am talking about one's invention of that figure of the mother. So if one thinks of the mother as one's first source of food at the intrauterine phase, that one is in the uterus and that is your source of sustenance, for me, food is about storytelling. It's about the stories that food tells about us, to echo some of the stuff we've heard before here, but also the story we tell about the world and our relationship to the world. And for me, or in my reading of Food, Pleasure and Poison in Cape Town, it is the materiality of the food that is itself the story. And Zayan's pointed to this by talking about that ancient history of what happens before colonialism, but also because of colonialism and in the wake of colonialism. And the undoing of that history and its materiality is not one that I think is so easily done, because that history speaks itself through our very bodies. And the bodies that have inherited that history, whether it's a history of consumption or a history of figuration. And so when I think of this notion of food, it is also a relationship to life and to life forms. And when I think of my own mother as the figure in the story of my own relationship to food, it is the figure of my mother standing in her yard, wearing an A-line dress, in a field of cabbages that she has planted herself. It is not the first yard, but it is the yard I remember her standing in, and the cabbages will have been subjected to poison to make sure that we could eat them, and not the snails or the other varieties of creatures. And so poison and pleasure were deeply connected there, because my mother took pleasure in growing the cabbages. I certainly took no pleasure in eating them, and as a child thought of them as poison. And yet as an adult, the sentimental connection with eating cooked cabbage connects me to my mother, and a new pleasure returns. And so that combination of what the child found to be metaphorical poison is what the adult finds to be metaphorical pleasure, because it puts me in the story acted for us, whether it is the child breastfeeding or gorging oneself on leftover pizza at 2 o'clock in the morning. There's a sense of joy while there is an awareness of the poison. We are, of course, increasingly aware of where our food comes from. I've always been intimately aware of where the food in my family came from, because my mother, in addition to growing those cabbages, also raised chickens and ducks. And I'd always been squeamish about eggs because I knew where they came from. I'd seen them emerge. I also didn't eat chicken because my father believed the chicken wasn't meat. Real meat was red and came from four-legged creatures. Chicken was not meat. I, of course, shared this prejudice in order to bond with my father in that Oedipal triangle against my mother, but at the same time, my reasons for not eating the chicken was very different from his reasons. I knew they were meat. I just also knew them as live creatures who were closer in size to me than the adults. I was never there for the slaughtering. I was never there for the plucking. That's what sisters were for. And I was a son. And so the poison of a patriarchal culture was there, present in the food that I consumed, how I related to that food, how that food arrived, even in moments which I now sentimentally think back of and think of as progressive. My mother grew our own food, but I didn't have to pluck that chicken. I am, of course, now no longer a consumer of other sentient creatures. I am the virtuous vegetarian. And I can disguise in this disinformation to myself the poison of the present. That the present contains the poison of both ignorance and disinformation. I don't carefully look at the labels of all the food that I consume. I do look at it sometimes, and so I'm surprised by chakalaka that comes from Turkey via Germany, and will refuse to buy it. But I will sometimes simply ignore, claim ignorance of some of the other issues. Some of this, of course, goes against my very specific education into a scientific understanding of the world, in which I think I find myself, that very notion of reason, rationality, and some of it is merely sentimental. I don't like eating things that can look back at me. And the story behind that is not one of ethics or virtue, it was one of mere trauma and horror. I'd bought meat, I was going to eat it, I put it in the freezer, I went away and signaled virtue by turning off the boiler. I had, of course, not turned off the boiler, I had turned off the outlet for the refrigerator. And when I returned 2 weeks later, it was CSI Grahamstown. Once I had to deal with the putrefied flesh in the freezer, I could no longer eat. So, like that relationship with the chickens, where because they were close and visible and vaguely friendly, I couldn't eat meat after that. So engagement for pleasure or enjoyment for pleasure is one aspect, but there's also status anxiety, which I think you've spoken to, about the way in which people consume meat to indicate that they are of a certain class. We now also consume things other than meat to indicate that we are of a certain class. So vegetarianism is also a class signal. It's a status signal. It has to do with status anxiety, and that status anxiety signals its own form of pleasure and a certain form of ideological poisoning. And here I think of Slavoj Žižek's notion of enjoying your symptom as yourself in consumption. And he's talking about nationalism, but in terms of food, I often think of this. One indulges in consuming substances that provide short-term pleasure, but certainly long-term harm. Gardens are a form of making, food is a form of making, but both are also forms of storytelling, much like the story I am unsuccessfully telling you now about my mother as a figure in that garden. I, of course, did not inherit this ability to garden. Things turn brown under my fingers. I don't have the ability to make things come alive. And part of this is, of course, ignorance, but also the convenience. So I encode my relationship to food as a way in which I relate to the world. But I also decode my food in a way that says, this is how I relate to the world, this is how I make sense of it. Politics and the food and the pleasure I derive from it is therefore both deeply private. It is my body, it is how I experience it, but it's also public because it is performative. When I eat in restaurants, what I order, how I look at the menu, what I make of the menu, the spelling errors I see in it, the descriptions of things that are not the things that they come when they arrive, the surprises when you should have opted into something that you didn't know you should have opted out of. And so there is a chain between me, my forebears, and the kinds of foods that we have in our families, which tells the story of our connections, not just to the past as temporal, but to the world. And so, as the son of a woman born in 1930, who grew up on the food of the Depression, and the particularly Anglophile food of her family, because her mother came from St. Helena Island in the late 1800s, within 3 centuries, the 19th, the 20th, and the 21st, I have a connection, not just going back in time around the food I consume and what I like, but also across spaces. And this does not only chain me in a positive way in storytelling, but also imprisons me in particular understandings, socialized into tastes of what is and what is not acceptable. Food without texture is not something that I'm particularly keen on. Food that's unitextual, unicolored, unitoned. And so for me, a certain kinds of food in South Africa, pap, is a breakfast food that I couldn't possibly consume at any other time of the day, and that's a socialized consequence of growing up with a snobbish mother who married beneath her class position and would never, ever let us forget this. And so the poisonous stories of families and food are also about the pleasurable stories of poisonous food served to people who did not deserve to have the food. The story of a brother who wanted a little more jelly than was allowed and was then forced to consume the entire bowl of jelly to teach him a lesson was one that was a kind of biblical parable in our family about wanting too much too soon when it wasn't due you. But he now retells the story with a particular poisonous pleasure around the harshness of his childhood against the luxury of the childhoods of his younger siblings. And so the pleasurable stories of poisoned relationships, rescued or not by food, is also about how we relate to one another. And in this society, how we think of Cape Town and food is about that confluence of historical periods, of populations who arrive and leave, of those of us who return, and in our lifetimes as adults between 1990 and now, have seen a change in the palette of Cape Town's food that we can enjoy. That when one arrived in 1990, there was a certain set of restaurants that you could go to. And then the world, because apartheid ended, invaded South Africa in all sorts of forms, and not just in restaurants, but in food suddenly available in supermarkets. And people discovered those forms. And my mother's contempt for such forms, because they represented a change in the texture of the food that she wanted to cook. And beyond that, therefore, for me, the story of food, pleasure, and poison in Cape Town is one in which starts in the womb and will, I hope, never end in the tomb. My fear is that I will die in Cape Town, and sometimes when one eats out, one does have that feeling that it is going to happen, particularly for a city with water resource problems, and a child who, having been picked by a rooster, is not fond of chickens and therefore has always been squeamish, finds that if one cannot really trust that the water is fresh and that it isn't enough and it may have sillage from the dam in it, has concerns and hypochondriacal responses to food in Cape Town, the tomb seems to me to beckon a little more often than not, which results in my own poisonous relationship to the location. And here I think I'm going to conclude by binding it back to how food and desire are intimately linked for many of us in Cape Town. That the consumption of food in public spaces is also linked to the ability to, or inability to, express desire. So far from that Tom Jones scene where you could gorge yourself on food in order to indicate to someone, the 18th century novel, not the Welsh singer, that you had enjoyed the food and therefore were capable of enjoying the person in front of whom you are enjoying the food. As a teenager with transgressive and delegitimated desires, you could not eat such food and lustfully look across the courtyard at Wembley or the Golden Dish without possibly getting poison back your way. And so when you now think of food and desire as an adult in returning, it is often both pleasurable to see young people do this very thing that you were not allowed to do, and slightly irritating because how dare they have this experience that was denied you. And then you think, oh no, but the food at Wembley can never be as good today as it was 25 years ago. Because quite frankly, 25 years ago, we, like my mother, genetically modified the food ourselves by growing it. And now the poor young people have their food poisoned for them by multinational corporations. And the tomatoes come not from Philippi, but in cold storage from Philippi, having been grown hydroponically, possibly in Israel. And therefore the poison of politics also invades the sense of pleasure that one has with food in Cape Town. Thank you.
A round of questions, comments of any sort. I see some kind of hands wanting to go up, but not quite going up.
Hello. Anybody, come on.
Surely something that's been prompted. Usually when, one hand, then there's going to be a whole lot of other hands. Tembi, thank you for opening things up. Do you need the mic? No.
Hi, Angelo. If there's anything that I listen to every speaker, but there's one thing that took me back in time, and now I'm able to understand why I can never have anything tinned, especially when it comes to sardines, because growing up, and my mother being a firstborn, it's all at the time we could afford because it meant she had to take care of her family, her siblings. I was around. She prioritized school for me, all those things. So what we ate was not important. But looking back and you think, wow, how far you've come, and you are actually able to pick where you can dine, what you pay, it doesn't matter. But you can't help but think of that time when you actually had to, you were poisoned, literally. So he broke it down. You were able to break it down so nicely for me in a beautifully storytelling way, and I appreciated that. That's why I said it's not deep.
Hi, I have a question to the panel, your thoughts on the issue. So there's been a re-emergence of the Gatsby as, you know, significant to the Cape Flats. So on the one hand, it could be argued that it's absolutely food poison and the bread and GMO. But on the other hand, it's really been celebrated as recognizing food politics of a community whose food or local food and culture has never been recognized. So I just thought, you know, open to a question to the panel. What's your thoughts on it? Thanks.
I think let's just take one more and then we'll get everybody to respond. Hey. Thanks for coming.
Hi guys. Sorry I missed most of this. I wish I was here for much longer, but I got to catch some of it and just get some of the spirit of it. I just wanted to say two things. I remember talking to a group of friends about class. And saying to them, I don't feel like I've moved or shifted class because I still have the mentality of getting as many canned foods as possible in case the money runs out. So I will buy, and like it's interesting what I buy as like a security. 2 tins of fish, of canned fish, some canned chickpeas, like those like canned things, and then I'll always buy a packet of mealie meal. Samp and beans and like the things that my family used growing up to raise us, right? So for some reason, even though I work at UCT and I get a nice little paycheck, I still have this mentality that no, I need these items in the cupboard in case the food runs out. So that's very interesting to think about how our families raised us to support us and to carry us through every month, and how that food, like if you mix one canned fish with some potatoes and something else, like for some reason it feeds like an entire household, and just a certain kind of regard towards that. And then the other thing is I called my brother this one time and I was talking about how I nostalgically made pap, maize meal pap, but then I put almond butter into it and all these like fancy things. And then he says, it's not nostalgia because if you were really in the township, you wouldn't have almond butter, you would have peanut butter or maybe just sugar or maybe just milk. And it's interesting because I didn't think of it that way. Yeah, but like just the ways in which we conflate class with particular types of food, but also security with certain kinds of food.
So I think some of those have been comments. There was one very direct question. So I want to say something about the Gatsby, but I'm going to start. I'll start here. No, not now. Okay.
I don't want to go first if that's okay.
Can I say my Gatsby thing? Can I say my Gatsby thing? Okay, I want to talk about the Gatsby because there's been the sentimentalizing and romanticizing of the Gatsby, and I know that there's a certain kind of tradition of scholarship, particularly at UWC in history, where the Gatsby has been turned into this food that was produced, you know, in response to apartheid. And I mean, you know, histories of food items are so much more complex than that. So it's not just an irritation with that reading, narrow reading of the Gatsby, but an irritation with narrow readings of all food items and their histories. So retrospectively, and Angelo, you spoke about this at the District 6 Museum, you know, the sort of idea of nostalgic food. This nostalgia for what? You know, something that never really existed in the first place. So that's my little rant about the Gatsby.
So to add into the rant against the Gatsby. Okay, so I've never had a Gatsby. And that's because my mother was a snob. So she was this middle-class woman who married a working-class man, and her children were not allowed to have things like polony. And she was a Muslim woman, so there was going to be, if I think that the pork anywhere near it, you're not having it. So I've actually never had it. I've seen it, I know what it is. But my concern around the Gatsby is like Desiree's. There is a fetishizing of this thing called authenticity. And there's also a fetishizing of recognition. As if recognition is legitimation, and legitimation is somehow necessarily good. And my concern around this kind of slippage from the one to the other is that poison and the poisoned histories of that kind of food and its materiality is often ignored because there's a need for cultural affirmation and celebration. And again, Cape Town and South Africa are not unique in this. When you go into the African American population, the food of slavery in the Deep South is deeply poisonous, very harmful in all sorts of ways. And people have been talking about how this, so there's the famous Boondocks cartoon in which they investigate soul food. And Yui, the progressive little brother, tells the story of how soul food, the film, is meant to celebrate this heritage of this authentic food that speaks back to African American history. But what they neglect to tell you, he says, is that this food is highly poisonous. And when Big Mama dies, she dies because she developed diabetes, and they show you how they lop off little bits of her body as she lies in the hospital. And it's a form of humorous critique of this by Erin Magruder. And I think in South Africa, part of my concern with the celebration of kusistas and samosas that are deep fried, and whether or not once you put an ingredient into a samosa, like, what was it? Spinach and feta. And you go, the Greeks have a telephone call that they need to make with this triangular thing that's been deep fried. But this authenticity obsession is, I think, about political affirmation needed in this moment, which doesn't recognize fully what that material history is, its harmful consequences, and the role of poison in that history and in its perpetuity. Because this idea that just because I enjoyed something as a child, it is necessarily good, and to go back there, it's fantastic. It's your example of the pup phenomenon, where your brother says to you, well, actually, no, you've zhuzhified and bougified pup, but, But we don't ask questions of starch, of experience, of energy levels, etc. It's a kind of, let's celebrate the past because it used to be denigrated by colonial conquerors or by apartheid apparatchiks. And my concern there is, it's not an either or. It's not either you buy green vegetables at Woolworths that have been prepackaged and washed, or you indulge in this poisonous glut of horror that will leave you feeling vile, even as you feel good. It's something else. And that something else requires of us to pay attention to that histories of deprivation and second-order business. But actually, we need to also acknowledge that there are made histories that can be unmade, and we don't have to, that there's a present, that the Gatsby in the present has been bougified. I mean, I know middle-class people who indulge in the Gatsby as some kind of authentic class tourism to their roots, which is obscene because it is not something I grew up with as working class in Cape Town, because my mother was a snob. So to me, having the bourgeois Gatsby is inauthentic in itself, as I celebrate because authenticity is inauthentic. The original Melktert recipe, the original, what was that? Malva pudding, the original biryani, and whether you call it biryani or biryani, and then it turns out to be Iranian in origin anyway, so, what's authentic? And so I'm far more interested in what people are currently doing with it than using it to legitimate some past to say, okay, it's all.
I think I agree with Angelo. I feel there's a lot of people that are trying to romanticize this idea of food and what it sort of used to represent or what they think it used to represent. And I think right now in South Africa, there's a lot of fusion of different cuisines, and people are trying to create something new with flavor. People are always trying to create fusions of different foods. And it becomes difficult in that when you have a fusion, it's almost like you're losing some kind of meaning. You're taking away from the core essence of what a dish is supposed to be. And so if it's in a sense where you're creating a Gatsby just to enjoy the Gatsby, then that's fine. But when it becomes somewhat of a fusion and people are romanticizing this idea, then that becomes problematic.
And the other part? This idea of in case of the food emergency and when the food runs out, it just reminded me so much of during Ramadan, you're not eating, like in the summertime, you're not eating for at least, 14 hours. And so obviously you go through this process and your stomach, your digestive system begins to shrink because the blood is not doing all the stuff that it's doing. And your appetite decreases. Yet, frantically, at least once a week, my father or my mother would rush, especially before Ramadan starts, but would rush to the supermarket and fill the fridge more than usual. So it's chock-a-block full. And you begin to think, but guys, we don't eat all this food. Where's it going? And it just ends up going to waste. Because it's dominated by this idea of lust, this desire to eat these foods because we're being, not to use this word, but it's this kind of sensibility, deprived of that food. And so you stuff the cupboards and the refrigerators and the freezers with food that you're not going to eat because no one can eat at the end of the day. It's enough just to have, like a small thing. So you just reminded me of that. And this thing about the Gatsby, it's also touching on what Angelo said in his discussion about the pleasure of poison. Because when you eat a Gatsby, it feels so good and it tastes so good. And my husband says he knows a few butchers who make the polony and the Viennas, but who refuse to eat it because they know what goes into it. And the olapvos that we get on a Wednesday at the butchery, that's so nasty, but so delicious if you cook it on the stove in the gas. And it's so nostalgic and it brings all this memory, and there's not quite a flavor profile like that, but it's really disgusting. And not because it's made from afal, but because the system that creates the end product, which is the meat, is so filled with poison through a poisonous methodology of below minimal wage, of really traumatic, animal livelihood or treatment. And having understood that personally from a young age, making it very difficult for my mother to then make decisions about who needs to eat what around the table, because this one doesn't like fishy fish, and this one is allergic to that, and now this one doesn't want to eat the meat because it's made from, etc., etc. But ultimately, in my experience of investigating food and our journeys through food and trying to find connection and history and identity with food in the Cape, it's so, especially Cape Malay cuisine, it's so stuffed and stuck with poison because it's so hyper-industrialized. And this is inherited from this industrialized nature of food, which is, at the other end of it, let's say that I knew a cow and we slaughtered the cow and it was actually halal and taiba, not like just the way they say halal, where they slaughter things like 1,000 chickens an hour or something ridiculous, but a true sense of healthy and ethical and, done with love. And we had to deconstruct the Gatsby and make it in that kind of way. Because of the politics and the appropriation that is rampant these days, it would be seen as like a whitey Gatsby, or like a Gatsby that was made completely using regenerative agriculture, from the bread to the polony. And it would take a lot of effort, and it would be hella expensive. It would probably be like at least 250 rand. But that's the dichotomy. It's that we either have something that is bekostig, because that's the point of the Gatsby. It's a good meal, like it'll fill you up for an affordable price between 4 people, between 2 people. But on the other side of it, if we had to do it in another way, it would be ridiculous, but also delicious. So I think this is this idea of poison. It really has 2 meanings, and it can be unpacked infinitely.
I just want to remind people that we've got another session after this, which is the performance of the play. There will also be a meal. So if some of you were thinking of leaving, rather get your friends that you were going to visit to come here to have the meal and watch the performance. But shall we take another quick round before we break for comments? Okay, there's one up there.
Hi guys. So I just wanted to say thank you just for this. So I used to be in the humanities food space, and now I recently moved to a more science food space. And just being here and listening to these conversations again just reignited my love of food, and just what food means to me, like in terms of its grounding abilities. But I was quite interested to find out from you guys, how do we connect science and food a little bit more? So how do we get scientists to understand that when you slaughter an animal with love, or when you take care of an animal with love, that will make a difference at the end of the day? When you grow food in terms of community and neighbors and what food means to people, how can we translate these things that a lot of us in this room know, but how do we translate it to people who are not here, who are hardcore scientists, who are saying, molecularly, what does this mean?
I just love Zian's story about cleaning her teeth and poisoning herself, because most recently I've been poisoning myself with things that I grew up with. I grew up in Immaculate, so I took some of my friends to see the flowers, and so I wanted to do an exhibition for today, and I was picking some of the indigenous plants that we ate as children and digging up some roots. And Desiree didn't want to believe me when I said the one was name called Pitsnot. And but in any case, I ended up, my eyes were swollen, I couldn't see, because some of those things were so poisonous, and I don't know whether my DNA has changed throughout the decades, and I just couldn't deal with it, with the very things that I've eaten. So that's the one. So the other one was recently we had a conversation. I said I drove past a bakkie that sold vine stumps and I thought, wow, when I come back, I'll buy some so that when I have a braai, I can actually use those stumps. But then I got in a conversation. I've actually forgot to buy it. So a couple of days after that, I had a conversation with people, and they said, never ever buy those vine stumps, because the vineyards are being sprayed with a lot of poison, so that if you braai the meat, that poison goes into the meat. So it was like, oh my God, I've been poisoning myself all along.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for that. I have 2 quick questions. The first is, what is your take on the relationship between food and language? We often have translated words like hunger into other parts of our lives, like we hunger for, or it's sort of a synonym for ambition and hunger for success. So how has language and that relationship with food affected how you understand and experience food? And then the second is the relationship between food and mental health. We often find that when we are down and when we are feeling anxiety or depression or even trauma, we respond by eating. And I just wanted to know what your thoughts are on that as well.
Hi, greetings everyone. Yeah, I just came in actually. I missed most of the talk, but I do have a question around. I do have a passion of food, as I am a food grower. So my question is about the change around. We all now are aware of our food systems, starting from the meat to the plants and that our daily consumption at home. So looking at the struggle now, that people are aware of what they're eating and what they're consuming, but now how do we change the existing system? Is it a matter of challenging the governments, or is it, how do we really, as much as we do have organization on the ground that actually challenge and do all those things, but it feels like a long struggle that actually has been going on for on and on. So what really can be done, like implemented, because we know half, most of our food are from the industrial farming and monoculture that is being actually spraying pesticides and everything, that actually we are aware that glyphosate causes cancer. So why are we having the systems that we are aware of, and how can we implement working with the government and challenging and changing that? Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, so direct answer to that would be the only people that organize agriculture has ever listened to the consumer, and we need to be a lot more deliberate about how we consume things. And just for sake of throwing it into the pot, our conversation needs to go one step upstream. So it was alluded to by many of the speakers, but generally the way we use all our natural resources in this country, as has been said in the recent National Biodiversity Assessment that came out, culminates in our freshwater systems being the most degraded of all the systems that we have. And we, again, as users of the systems, need to be pushing back and saying we want them to be treated in a way which we can still use them. Yeah.
Maybe to respond to the question about science and food, I think first of all there's a difference maybe between corporate science and scientism and actual science. And I think knowledge production has been hugely privatized by corporations who have a very particular agenda, and what they call science is not necessarily science. Pretty much this, when you hear the term junk science, it's usually coming from corporations who are trying to ensure that their products are not regulated. So for example, you'll always hear that arguments against GMOs are based on junk science, or originally it came from arguments against smoking is based on junk science. And there's a kind of way of hoodwinking the public about what science is and what science inquiry is about, and a way of kind of annihilating the opposition who are trying to bring other aspects about safety of food or other aspects of food to the fore. And those are driven by very powerful propaganda and PR machinery, and are very, very powerful. But I think The other is that science, when you say how do you change a hardcore scientist to believe in the sacred or in what might seem like magical kind of concepts of praying over a halal food, I think that those are incompatible systems of knowing and being, and what is possibly more productive is to kind of end the tyranny of science and say, well, let's acknowledge multiple worlds and multiple ways of being, and when a scientific tool is the right tool to use, then let's use that one, but let's also embrace other forms of knowledge and kind of break that tyranny. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Shall we also make concluding remarks? So, to carry on from what Hayesha said about science, this idea that there is a distinction between the sciences and humanities is a very specific recent phenomenon. So if one goes back to just the century before the last one, so into the mid-1800s, scientists were not outside of the humanities. So if one thinks of somebody like Darwin or Humboldt, these were figures who were also participating in the space of culture by writing. And The Voyage of the Beagle, The Origins of Species, they read much like the 19th century and 18th century novels alongside which they exist. A figure like Goethe is not a scientist. A figure like Linnaeus. Elsewhere in the world, and much earlier, somebody like Ibn Khaldun is doing complicated work that is both scientific as well as literary, which links to this question of language. That we forget that all language is metaphorical. So even when scientists use them, there's a gap between what they're referring to and the word they're using for it. And so the stability and easy reference a good scientist knows is not there. That it is a description and an analytical description to talk about a thing that does not exist in that form, which is not to say that science is imaginary. I also slightly disagree that I think with a statement that says people are aware of what they're eating. I'm not sure people are as aware of what they're eating as they could be. So in a country where 8 out of 10 10-year-olds cannot read for meaning in any language whatsoever, my concern is what do they then know about the world and how do they make sense about the world? And I also don't think it stops at 10. I don't think between 10 and 11 somehow suddenly people become able to make sense of the world. I think that there is a great sense of information and very little meaning circulating because people often have information given to them, much of it not reliable, often couched in this rhetoric that is false and misleading, that says this is junk science. But if they were more literate, they would be able to understand that this is not a message that I need to believe. There is this marketing currently of this dairy drink that is neither milk nor it's a kind of weird butter, but not milk, but flavored like custard. Oh, vanilla flavored milk. And all I could think of is, where would I use this as a drinker of milk? And then I realized, I was reading this as this is industrially processed in all sorts of ways that milk straight from the cow wouldn't be, and that this is technically no longer really milk. Coffee is another example, right? So we've just gone through a process in this country where mixtures of chicory and coffee can no longer be sold as coffee. And this was not a question of health or literacy, this was a question of corporate interests, marketing, and profit. And so I think education is one example, and not to preempt Zayan, but I also think that this idea that government is going to resolve it, I think we have a spectacular record in not just South African, that government's relationship with multinational corporations globally have shifted in ways that benefit multinational corporations, and governments are no longer necessarily the strong bars of imprisonment between you and, invoke Noam Chomsky's idea of the roaming tiger that eats human beings that's behind the bars. The bars have been softened, the tiger has gotten in, the prisoner and the tiger are now working together, and you are the meal. And then, to just my last word on this is, I think the question of the industrial component and the violation of the rights and ways of being of other sentient beings is part of the failure of the empathy circuit in human life in late modernity. That if the slaughtering happens far away, behind a wall I cannot see, if the treatment of the thing that I'm going to consume is happening far away from me, it is easier to claim ignorance. It is easier to be subjected to that ignorance than it would be in my story that I briefly told of growing up with the chickens and seeing where the egg comes from and making the connection via the family encyclopedia between the chicken egg and the human egg that I am told I come from. Right? So that the empathy circuit is gone. That doesn't mean I stop eating eggs or I stop eating meat. I just have a very different ethical relationship to it because my empathy circuit has not been industrially short-circuited by the process. So Mary's example of not knowing. We all don't know all sorts of things until they're told to us. But you could also make the decision because you understood at some level the scientific processes of why it is that you would no longer burn the vine sticks because you'd been told. But we do live in a country where people are not told this, or worse, they're told it doesn't matter that this is the case because it serves corporate profits to continue to poison the population because short-term profits over long-term people is the nature of this capitalist society that we live in. It is why we do to the environment what we do. Short-term water wastage and overuse over long-term survival. And my hope out of this is younger people who are not putting up with this, who are standing up and standing against and refusing the level of interpolation that the dominant systems of our society would like them to subject themselves to and fling themselves underneath. And again, it's not just local, it's global. And its hope is not its immediate success. Its hope is its sustainability and longevity, not whether I see results in my lifetime.
I just wanted to respond to the question about how we can respond to the systems that exist and should we wait for the government. I think we need to move, those of us who are conscious, we need to move from a state of consciousness to intentionality because there are people, there are small-scale urban farmers that are trying to do the right thing, growing things the right way in communities, and we need to be intentional about seeking those opportunities out and actually supporting people that are doing this because they can't compete with the big corporations. They can't compete with your Woolworths, your Checkers, whatever. So we need to actually go out there and find people that are doing this and support their business. And then secondly, again, to do with the government, I think a lot of people became aware of the lack of the government's concern when listeriosis happened. And people suddenly realized that we leave a lot of our regulation or the quality of our foods in the hands of people, and those people don't care. So suddenly we had a lot of people generally just being so conscious about what are we eating, this polony, this meat, this smoked whatever, and it's actually you're consuming that, but who's actually regulating what goes in there and the practices around that? Yeah.
Hello? Yeah. Thank you for that story, for that anecdote. It's very curious for me because with a lot of the work with seeds, there's, Rupert, is it called plasticity when like the same plant has a differentness to it? And thus, when we approach the plant, there's a different reaction. And I have many examples of that. And I think it might be the distance, but it might also be, Namakoland is a place that's so specific in its environment that I'm sure any minimal change creates quite a big change within the local biosphere, you know? Seasonality as well. So it could have been just a different time, it could have been many different things, but yeah, I also have quite a few stories about poisoning myself with smoke, trying to prepare food. And just to touch on this idea of science and love and science and the way that the world works, because you kind of have to think in terms of it's more science and economy, like the fellow speakers have said. And the way that laws work or the way that government functions is through different spaces of knowledge. And so you have potential academic spaces that do a lot of research, independent scientific spaces, privatized scientific spaces, and these then influence the kind of laws and propose the way the working system of a space like government works, to influence the way that the state is run. And that's a very particular lens and a very small way of knowing compared to a majority of existence of people, of land, of animals, etc., that the state or the government is also governing. And there's a very particular use of language, which I'm going to touch on as well. So my research with the seed stuff is to really say that the premise is seed as not as an anecdote, but as a kind of lens of all things that live, has been objectified and made invisible over many, many hundreds of years, but through a particular practice of taking ownership of a particular narrative. So the reason or the way that a lot of the food bills and the seed laws and the seed bills have come to be is because the narrative is that, but if you give us as the scientists and seed producers and kind of global corporations the power and the mandate to secure our food security for the future. We have the resources, we have the power, we have the land, we just need this and this from you. So, and you can read it through all the parliamentary debates. They're speaking about food security. But at the end of the day, this is not the food that is feeding the people. And if it is the food that's feeding the people, it's very thin. And so this idea of language plays a very vital role in convincing things like laws and creating spaces for buy-in. And obviously there's a lot of collusion that's happening behind the scenes, and people are very like chomi, and we're not privy to that. So when one comes, having come from an organizational space and seeing that going to parliament, lobbying for certain things, writing report after report, and understanding that personally for me, my power does not lay in that kind of practice, and it's exhausting, and it's going to kill me, and nothing changes. I did not get one response from anything I ever wrote to government after so many of these things. And so, Tuma, to answer a little bit towards that, it's so complex that yes, it's very much an individual choice, and it has to come from there. And I also have the experience of being able to do it to the point that I wasn't supporting an industrialized notion in terms of food and cleanliness and hygiene and medicine. But then I got married. And my husband works for the Epping Market, and he sells bananas. And because there's a lot of gifting that happens in that world between brokers and between people, we often get boxes of tomatoes or nectarines or whatever. And so coming from this like only eating regenerative agriculture, blah, 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 and supporting people, blah, 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 now I'm dealing with the reality of the majority of the food that's being produced that's going to waste is coming into my sacred space of my home and needs to be utilized. And I need to make decisions around that and navigate around that, because I can't say, don't bring this stuff into, it's your work, it's what you do, and it's who you are, and this was gifted with love, you know? So the complexities are so hyper that at the end of the day also, the majority of people are accessing that kind of food. And the choice that we have in terms of what access we have, it really does go around class and poverty and affordability, because also at the end of the day, in many parts of Mitchell's Plain, you can't get fresh fruit and vegetables, and many other parts of the nation and the world. So it's complex. The last thing I wanted to say around food and language and food and mental health. what I started realizing with the work that I do is because it doesn't sit within employment, and I kind of work where the need is and somehow maintain some kind of employment through that. One easy way to do the work I do is through food literacy. And so it's adding the kind of this embedded nature of storytelling and creating themes from which to work, so that the audience to whom I'm speaking can assimilate the knowledge easier. And this is particularly interesting and true for children, and especially children who grow up with less agency than others, so children who are in homes and institutions or orphanages and stuff like this. And that's proven very interesting just personally for my practice and how I can be better doing the work that I do. And in terms of mental health, for my mental health, when I am in a depressive episode, I cannot eat. And there's no consumption happening. Maybe once in a while I'll smoke a joint kind of thing, but there's not, the nourishment disappears, and the desire to feed myself, it becomes about survival. But it's very interesting because on the other spectrum, that's what people do, is to eat or to overeat, and there's many different aspects, and I'm sure in critical food studies there's people who are investigating that a lot. Final point I wanted to say, maybe I should just stop. Food security, food and language. I guess actually this is an important point. So I grew up in a city, very, very city, and we didn't have gardens kind of thing. And when I learned plants, and I did landscaping and horticulture and stuff like that, my first language into plants was Latin. And so I was embedded with the scientific nature and notion of knowing plants. And our main focus was indigenous plants. They drilled it into us. But as I developed outside of the academic space and developed working in organizational spaces with people who don't care about Latin, honestly, and the switch became more important to know colloquial names and the names of plants that people knew, even if, that name was a different name in a different place, even though the villages are very close together. So there's just an important, language is so important in everything, like Angela also said, but it's this constant kind of learning and unlearning, and also creating new words, and just sometimes we just make up names for plants, and that's what it's called now, because the only other name we have, whatever, So, okay, the end.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to wrap it up now, otherwise we won't have enough energy to see the rest of the evening through. So we will return here after our meal by 7 for the play. Just if we can